The letter was already sealed when Jasper Walker found it. He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse kitchen, trail dust still coating his boots, sweat drying cold on the back of his neck after a full day of pushing cattle across the southern pasture. The afternoon light came through the window in long amber strips, and there was Margaret Conley at the table, her dark hair pinned up neat the way she always wore it when she was trying to hold herself together, her hands flat against the worn wood surface, a sealed envelope sitting between her palms like a verdict she had already delivered on herself. She did not hear him come in. He stood there for 3 full seconds watching her, and in those 3 seconds he saw everything he had been afraid to name for the better part of 2 years. The rigid set of her shoulders, the deliberate stillness of a woman who has made a decision that cost her something enormous and is now only waiting for the world to catch up with her choice. On the envelope was written one name, Dr. Harlan Prout, San Francisco, California. The room tilted under Jasper Walker's boots. He knew who Harlan Prout was. Everybody in Millhaven, Texas knew who Harlan Prout was, because Margaret had spoken of him exactly twice, and both times Jasper had watched her face do something complicated and wounded that she never fully explained. Prout was the physician who had treated her father in the months before the old man died. He was also, Jasper had pieced together through careful listening and longer silences, the man who had promised Margaret something once. Something she had believed in long enough to wait for, and something that had never materialized. Until now, apparently. He took one step into the kitchen. The floorboard gave a low creak. Margaret's head came up fast, and the look on her face in that first unguarded instant was the most honest thing Jasper had ever seen from her. It was not guilt exactly. It was something worse than guilt. It was sorrow. Bottomless, preemptive sorrow, the kind a person wears when they have already grieved a thing before it has even been lost. "Jasper," she said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "That letter is to San Francisco." She did not reach to cover it. She did not lie. Margaret Conley had many difficult qualities, and not one of them was dishonesty. "Yes, Prout. Yes." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled to its absolute limit. Jasper Walker was 31 years old. He had built this ranch with his hands from scrub and clay soil, had buried his father and his younger brother on this same land, had survived a drought and a cattle sickness that wiped out half the herds in Greer County, had ridden through weather that should have killed lesser men. People in Millhaven called him steady. They called him unshakable. He had worn that reputation the way a man wears a coat in winter, gratefully and out of sheer necessity. He was shaking now. Inside, where nobody could see it, but shaking all the same. "You are leaving," he said. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the envelope. "I was going to tell you tonight." Something raw and ungovernable rose in his chest. 2 years. 2 years of this woman living 6 miles down the road on the neighboring property that had been her father's. 2 years of her coming to Sunday dinner and helping with the books when he asked. 2 years of conversations that went long past what conversation needed to go. 2 years of standing close enough to smell the lavender she put in her hair and never once saying the word that had been living in his throat the whole time. He had been careful. He had been respectful. He had been so infernally patient, waiting for the right moment, telling himself she needed time, that she was still grieving, that he should not rush a woman like Margaret Conley because she was worth waiting for and he was willing to do it. And she had been writing to Harlan Prout in San Francisco. "When?" he asked. 2 weeks. "I have arranged passage on the stage to Abilene and then the rail from there." 2 weeks, he repeated, hearing his own voice as though it belonged to someone standing slightly behind him. "You had this arranged and you did not think to say anything." "I did not know how. Margaret, Jasper, then I am coming with you," he said. The words came out before he had fully decided to say them, which was how he knew they were entirely true. He had not planned them. There was no calculation in them. There was only the sudden absolute clarity of a man who has reached the outer edge of his own patience and found on the other side of it not resignation but something fiercer and more decisive than anything he had ever felt in his life. Margaret stared at him. "You cannot be serious," she said. I have never said a less funny thing in my life. Jasper, you have a ranch, you have cattle, you have employees who depend on. I have been in love with you for 2 years, he said, and the words landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a great height. And I was a fool who kept waiting for a better moment, and there is apparently not going to be a better moment, so this one will have to do. The color left her face. Then it came back, too fast, flooding her cheeks with something she could not entirely conceal. You do not know what you are saying, she whispered. I know exactly what I am saying. The question is what you are going to tell me. She looked at the letter, she looked at him. And in her eyes was a whole dark history that she had never fully shared, a past full of hidden motives and broken promises and choices made under duress, and Jasper could see that she wanted to say something and did not know how to begin. Sit down, he said, and his voice had gone gentler. Please, just sit and talk to me. We have time. 2 weeks is time enough for a real conversation. She sat. After a moment, so did he. The letter sat between them on the table like a confession neither of them had made yet. And that was how the story really started. Margaret Conley had come to Millhaven, Texas in the spring of 1878, which was how long ago 2 years felt now if you tried to count the days. She had come because her father, George Conley, had been dying, and dying men needed their daughters even when those daughters had lives elsewhere that they were in the process of dismantling. She had left behind a life in St. Louis, Missouri, which was a fact that everyone in Millhaven knew and that nobody fully understood, because St. Louis to a town like Millhaven was something close to a foreign country. She had been working there as a school teacher, had been engaged once, and that engagement had ended in a way she never discussed precisely. She had come to Texas carrying 2 trunks and a quality of watchfulness that the women of Millhaven recognized immediately as the look of someone who had been surprised badly enough to develop a permanent alertness against future surprises. Her father's land adjoined the Walker Ranch to the south. This was the practical reason she and Jasper had met within a week of her arrival. Jasper's father, Edmund Walker, had been dead 4 years by then. His younger brother Thomas had been dead for 2, killed by a fever that moved through the county the winter of 1876 with a deliberate cruelty that spared no particular family. Jasper had been running the ranch alone since Edmund's passing, had hired 3 hands named Caleb Ruiz, Henry Draper, and an older man everyone called Boots who had been with the ranch since before Jasper was born. The operation was stable. More than stable, if he was being honest. The Walker Ranch was one of the better-kept properties in Greer County, which was something Jasper accepted with quiet pride and continued working toward without much ceremony. He had brought her father a pound of salt pork the first week she arrived, because that was what neighbors did, and because he had wanted to see her. That wanting had surprised him. He was not a man given to immediate impressions. He observed carefully before he concluded anything. But Margaret Conley had opened the door of her father's farmhouse in a dark dress with flower on her sleeve, and a look in her dark eyes that combined exhaustion and iron determination in a ratio he had never seen before, and something in his chest had rearranged itself without asking his permission. They had been careful with each other from the start. She was newly arrived, and her father was dying, and there was a grief already settling in around her edges that demanded a certain respect. He had given that respect instinctively, because it was in his nature to give people the space they needed, and because he found, somewhat to his confusion, that he was not in any particular hurry. He could wait. He had land and work and the long stretches of Texas sky to occupy him, and he found himself content to build a friendship with her one conversation at a time, trusting that the rest would follow. What he had not accounted for was that she might be building something else entirely while he was being patient. The Harlan Prout situation was this. Prout had been a traveling physician who came through Millhaven in the autumn of 1878, sent by a charitable organization in Dallas to provide medical care to rural areas that lacked a permanent doctor. He had treated George Conley through the worst of his decline, had been skilled and professional, and had possessed, in addition, a particular kind of smooth personal charm that made people feel at ease and cared for in ways that went slightly beyond the merely medical. He and Margaret had spoken at length. Of that much Jasper was certain, because he had seen it happening, had watched her face in those conversations, and noticed how it opened up in ways it usually did not. He had told himself he was reading too much into ordinary human warmth. He had told himself she was simply grateful for someone tending to her father with competence. He had been half right and half spectacularly wrong. What he did not learn until Margaret told him in the kitchen that evening was the full shape of what had happened. Prut had not merely been kind. He had made promises. Quiet ones, the kind a man makes when he wants a woman to wait for him and does not want to formalize it enough that she can hold him to it. He had told her he was establishing a practice in San Francisco, that it was going to be significant, that he would send for her when it was in place. He had said this to her during her father's final weeks, when she was worn raw and vulnerable, and someone speaking of a future had felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. She had waited. George Conley had died in January 1879. She had stayed on because the land needed to be dealt with, and because she had nowhere urgent to be, and because, she admitted now in the kitchen with the lamplight going gold between them, Millhaven had begun to feel less temporary than she had expected. But the letter from Prut had arrived 3 weeks ago. An actual letter, the first direct communication in over a year, informing her that the practice was established, that he was doing well, that San Francisco was a remarkable city, and that he hoped she had been getting on all right. There was an invitation in it, oblique, not explicit. The kind of invitation a man extends when he wants the option open but is not willing to commit to anything binding. An invitation designed, in other words, to give him all the advantage and her all the risk. She had written back yes. Jasper listened to all of this without interrupting, which cost him something considerable, because the more she spoke the clearer it became that Harlan Prut was a man of hidden motives and managed distances. A man who had kept Margaret Conley in a holding pattern as long as it suited him without ever giving her the security of a real choice. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Texas night had come down full, and the sound of crickets came through the window screen with a patient, steady persistence. "Do you love him?" Jasper asked. The question sat in the air between them. Margaret looked at her hands on the table. Her fingers were not quite still. "I thought I did. When he left, I thought I would surely die of missing him, the way you do when you are quite certain a thing is true. And now," she was quiet for a moment that told him everything. "I have not seen him in over a year," she said. "I am not certain I know what I feel." "Then why are you going?" She looked up at him, and the look was complicated in the way that only deeply intelligent people's expressions get complicated, multiple things true at once and none of them comfortable. "Because I am 30 years old, Jasper. Because my father is gone, and this land is not mine in any permanent sense, and I have been living 6 miles from your fence line for 2 years without any clear notion of what I am building or why I am building it. Because at least Harlan offered something with a shape to it, something I could point at and say, that is a future." Jasper leaned forward on his elbows and looked at her directly. "And if I offered you something with a shape to it?" The silence was different this time, charged rather than empty. "You are saying that now," she said quietly, "because I am about to leave. I am saying it now because you are about to leave, and I would rather say it 2 years too late than never say it at all. But I want you to understand that I have been thinking it for considerably longer than tonight." She studied him with those careful dark eyes, the eyes that had been watching the world for deceptions and broken promises long enough to have developed a very fine sensitivity for both. He met her gaze and did not look away, because the one thing he had to offer her that Harlan Prut apparently could not was the simple, straightforward fact of meaning every word he said. "You would really come to San Francisco," she said. It was not quite a question. "I would. If that is what it takes, I would make arrangements for Caleb to manage the ranch. He is capable of it. I would sell what needs to be sold and leave what can wait. I am not a man with nothing to lose, Margaret, but I am a man who has already decided what matters more. Something moved in her face. Not surrender exactly. Something more like the beginning of permission. I need to think, she said. Then think, he said. I am not going anywhere tonight. He was not, in fact, going anywhere for the next 14 days. That was the essential fact of the matter. He had 2 weeks to do what he had failed to do for 2 years, which was to show Margaret Conley, clearly and without ambiguity, what kind of man he was and what kind of life he was capable of offering her. He did not approach this as a campaign. That was not in his character. He approached it the way he approached every significant thing in his life, with steadiness and sincerity and a refusal to perform. The next morning he came to her farmhouse at a reasonable hour and asked if she needed help repairing the section of fence along the north pasture that had been leaning badly since the spring rains. She said she did. They worked side by side in the growing heat of the morning, him driving posts and her handing wire, and they talked the way they always talked when the work gave the conversation something to hang itself on, easily and honestly, about things that mattered. He asked her about St. Louis, and she told him more than she usually did, about the school she had taught in, about the engagement that had ended, which turned out to have involved a man who had told her repeatedly that her opinions were more passionate than appropriate in a woman, and who had seemed genuinely surprised when she finally decided. She agreed with his assessment well enough to refuse to marry it. Jasper had listened to this and found himself considerably less surprised than perhaps he should have been, because Margaret's opinions were in fact very passionate and also almost uniformly correct, and the idea of a man finding that quality inconvenient struck him as the purest kind of fool. He said so, not elaborately, but plainly. She had looked at him sideways with something shifting in her expression, something tentative and warm that she was not quite ready to name out loud. In the afternoon, he rode back to his own ranch and dealt with the pressing business of the day, which included a conversation with Caleb Ruiz that was both honest and necessary. Caleb was 27, had been working the Walker Ranch for 5 years, and had the kind of practical intelligence and genuine loyalty that made him the obvious choice for an extended management role. Jasper laid out the situation without embellishment. "I may need you to run things here for a period of time," Jasper said. "Could be a few weeks, could be longer. I will write regular instructions and send funds on schedule." Caleb had listened carefully and then said, with the quiet directness that Jasper appreciated in him, "This is about Miss Conley." "It is." Caleb nodded once, the nod of a man who has been watching a situation develop for 2 years and is not remotely surprised it has arrived at a crisis point. "I can manage it." "I know you can," Jasper said. "That is why I am asking." The second day he brought Margaret a copy of a novel he had ordered from a bookseller in Dallas, a purchase he had made 3 months earlier after she mentioned in passing that she had been wanting to read it. He had simply forgotten to give it to her, he said, which was not entirely true but was true enough that he did not feel dishonest saying it. She held it in both hands and looked at him with an expression that went dangerously close to undone. "You remembered that," she said. "You mentioned it once. Most men do not listen to the things women say once." "I listen," he said simply. "I always have." The third day she invited him to dinner without him suggesting it first, and he recognized this as something significant. She cooked well, unsurprisingly. She cooked the way she did everything else, with competence and attention and a refusal to do anything halfway. She made a roasted chicken with root vegetables and cornbread, and there was a jar of preserved peaches from her father's old pantry that she opened as though she had been saving it for a particular occasion. They sat across from each other at the farmhouse table, the same table where the sealed letter had been sitting 3 days ago, and the quality of the silence between them had changed entirely. It was warm now, rather than heavy. It was the silence of people who know each other well enough to be comfortable in the spaces between words. She asked him about Thomas, his brother. She had not asked directly before, and the fact that she asked now told him something about how the distance between them was closing. He told her about Thomas carefully, choosing the true things. How Thomas had been the lighter of the two of them, quicker to laugh, more willing to take a risk without calculating it first. How the fever had taken him in the space of 11 days, and Jasper had not been prepared for how the ranch felt afterward, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with actual noise. How grief worked differently on different people, and his way had been to work harder and talk less, which was not necessarily the healthiest approach, but was the one he had been capable of at the time. "You have been alone a long time," she said, not with pity, with recognition. "I have." She was quiet for a moment. "So have I, even when I was surrounded by people, even in St. Louis." There is a particular kind of alone that does not have anything to do with whether anyone is physically present. "Yes," he said. "That kind exactly." She looked at him across the table and he looked at her, and between them, in that small farmhouse on the Texas plains with the night pressing dark and soft against the windows, something that had been building for 2 years was very nearly said, and neither of them said it quite yet, but both of them felt it arrive. On the 5th day, trouble. A man named Delbert Cross rode up to Margaret's property line just after noon. Cross was a land speculator who had been circling the area for months, a sharp-faced man from Austin with city clothes and a habit of presenting legal paperwork at inconvenient times. He had been interested in George Conley's land since before the old man died, which was itself a fact that said something unflattering about Delbert Cross's character. He had a document with him. Margaret stood on her porch with her arms folded and read it while Cross sat on his horse with an expression of prepared patience. The document was a claim, an older claim, dating to a land dispute between George Conley and a man named Aldrich from the 1860s. Cross was asserting that the resolution of that dispute had never been properly recorded in the county register, which, if true, cast the title to the southern 40 acres of the Conley property into question. It was the kind of legal maneuver that required a lawyer to properly contest, or at least someone with enough familiarity with county records to verify or disprove the underlying claim. Margaret read every word of the document without changing expression, handed it back to Cross, and told him she would be in touch through proper channels. The moment his horse was out of sight, she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and the look on her face was one Jasper had not seen before, a specific flavor of anger that had fear underneath it. He had ridden over that afternoon and found her at the table with the county record, ledger her father had kept, going through pages with the methodical determination of a woman who does not allow herself to panic, but is working very hard to keep the panic at bay. She told him what had happened in clear, precise sentences. Jasper sat down and read the document she had copied out by hand. He was not a lawyer, but he had dealt with enough land contracts and county paperwork to understand the shape of what Cross was trying to do. It was a shakedown, dressed in legal language. Whether the underlying claim about the 1860s dispute was real or manufactured was a question that required verification, but the intent was obvious enough. Cross wanted the land at a distressed price, or he wanted to create enough uncertainty about the title that Margaret would simply accept a settlement and leave. "He knows you are planning to go," Jasper said. Margaret looked up sharply. "How would he know that?" "Small town, people talk." He paused. "Is betting you will settle rather than stay and fight it." Something hardened in her face. "He is betting wrong." Jasper felt a surge of something warm and strong move through his chest. "I know a land attorney in Abilene, Robert Ashby. He has handled disputed title cases across 3 counties, and he does not lose them unless the other party is actually right." He paused. "Which in this case they are not." "How can you be sure?" "Because I knew your father, and I know he was meticulous about his records." "Which means if there is a proper registration of that 1860s resolution, it is somewhere in this house. We find it, and Cross has nothing." They spent 3 hours going through George Conley's papers together. The old man had kept everything, a quality that Jasper found himself genuinely grateful for. Letters, receipts, legal notices, survey records. They sat side by side on the floor of the back room with boxes of documents between them, sorting through decades of careful record-keeping, their shoulders nearly touching in the lamplight. Jasper found it. It was in a leather-bound folder at the bottom of the second box, a notarized record of settlement in the boundary dispute between George Conley and James Aldrich, dated June of 1864, duly witnessed and recorded in Greer County, with a county seal intact. He held it up. Margaret took it from his hands and stared at it for a long moment, and then she pressed it briefly against her chest and closed her eyes, and the expression on her face was one of such pure, undefended relief that Jasper had to look away for a moment because looking directly at it felt like seeing something he was not supposed to see. "We send this to Ashby by the morning stage," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Cross will hear from the county recorder's office within a week. After that he has no claim." She looked at him. She had not moved away from him, and he had not moved away from her, and they were close enough that he could see the exact moment when the relief shifted into something else, something softer and more dangerous. "Jasper," she said. "Yes. Why are you doing all of this?" He met her eyes steadily. "You know why." She did know. He could see that she knew. What she was really asking was something harder, something that had to do with her own willingness to believe it, which was a question that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what Harlan Pruitt had cost her. He did not push. He let the moment be what it was. He helped her put the papers back in their folder, helped her seal the document that would go to Ashby in the morning, and then he said goodnight and rode home through the dark Texas night with the stars overhead burning enormous and indifferent, and his heart beating in a way it had not beaten since he was considerably younger. The letter to Pruitt was still sitting in the drawer where Margaret had put it when she took it off the table on the first night. She had not sent it. She had not told Jasper she had not sent it, but she had not sent it, and she knew why, and knowing why was the beginning of something she was not entirely ready to name. She had been honest with herself about Harlan Pruitt for some time, in the way that women who have been disappointed by men are eventually forced to be honest about the exact nature of that disappointment. The truth was that what she had felt for Pruitt had been real, but had been built on a shaky foundation of gratitude and loneliness, and his very considerable skill at making people feel special without actually investing anything real in them. He had a talent for it. The kind of talent that was a warning sign if you were paying attention, and she had not been paying sufficient attention at the time because her father was dying, and attention had been in short supply. She had waited for him for over a year with decreasing conviction, keeping the possibility of him alive in the way you keep a candle burning in a window, less because you actually believe anyone is coming, and more because extinguishing the flame feels like giving up. Jasper Walker had never made her feel like a candle in a window. He made her feel like the whole room. She did not say this out loud because she was not, by nature, a woman who said things like that out loud. But she thought it, sitting at her father's kitchen table in the evening of the 6th day since Jasper had walked in and found the letter and said, with absolute calm conviction, that he was coming with her. He had not asked her to cancel the trip. He had not argued against San Francisco or made the case for Millhaven in the abstract. He had simply, steadily been himself, with an unself-consciousness that she found both disarming and deeply compelling, because it was the opposite of every hidden motive she had ever had to protect herself from. He had no hidden motive. He had one motive, which he had stated plainly, and which he had been demonstrating with every subsequent action in the most straightforward possible way. The document went to Ashby in Abilene on the 7th day, carried by the morning stage. Jasper rode with her to town to see it off. They had coffee afterward at the small hotel dining room on the main street of Millhaven, the only establishment in town that served coffee in anything approaching a civilized setting. The dining room was nearly empty at that hour, just an older couple at the far table and Bess Holcomb behind the counter, who had the particular quality of appearing not to be listening that meant she was listening with complete attention. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "Tell me something you have never told anyone." Jasper looked at her with an expression of mild surprise that resolved into something more considered. He was quiet for a moment. "When Thomas died," he said, "I went through a period of about 4 months where I seriously considered selling the ranch and going north. Montana, maybe, just going somewhere where nothing needed me to be who I was." He paused. "I had a buyer looked at, I had papers drawn up." She had not known this. No one knew this, she suspected. "What stopped you?" "I could not figure out what I was going toward," he said. "You can run from something if you know what you are running toward. Otherwise you are just running, and I am not built for running." She thought about this. "I think I have been running," she said quietly. "For a long time, I thought I was going toward things. Toward Prout, toward San Francisco. But I think what I have actually been doing is running away from staying still, because staying still means accepting that things did not work out the way I planned, and that is an uncomfortable thing to accept." He looked at her with an attention that she had by now come to recognize as characteristic of him, the full focus of a man who is genuinely interested rather than performing interest. "Things very rarely work out the way we plan them," he said. "That is not the same as them not working out." She looked at him across the small table with the Texas morning coming in through the window, and she thought that she had been looking at this man for 2 years and had not quite allowed herself to see what she was looking at, and the recognition of that was arriving in her now with the combined force of something long delayed. "Jasper," she said. "Yes. I have not sent the letter." The stillness that moved through his face was extraordinary. It was not a dramatic stillness. It was the stillness of a man absorbing something enormous with all his capacity, every part of him attending to it. "I know," he said quietly. She blinked. "How?" "Because I know you," he said. "And you are not a woman who would still be having these conversations with me if you had already committed yourself in another direction. You are too honest for that." She set her coffee cup down. "I am not certain what I am committing to in this direction either," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "You do not have to be certain of everything at once," he said. "Neither do I. I am certain of one thing, and that is enough to start with." "What thing?" He met her eyes without flinching. "That my life is considerably better with you in it than without you, and I would like the opportunity to go on proving that if you will let me." The older couple at the far table was ostentatiously looking out the window. Bess Holcomb was wiping a counter that had been clean for several minutes. Margaret Conley sat across from Jasper Walker and felt something she had almost forgotten was possible, which was the particular sensation of being entirely safe and entirely alive at the same time, the sensation of being in the presence of a person who sees you clearly and is not afraid of what they see. She said, "Ask me properly." He understood her meaning completely and immediately, which told her something important about how well he actually knew her. He did not fumble or overthink it. He simply leaned forward across that small table in the nearly empty hotel dining room and said, "Margaret Conley, I am asking you to let me court you officially and without any further ambiguity, with the full intention of asking you to marry me when you are ready to hear it and not a moment before." It was the most perfectly calibrated thing anyone had ever said to her in her life. "Yes," she said. "That is acceptable." Bess Holcomb dropped a spoon. Nobody commented on it. The days that followed had a quality that Margaret would later find difficult to describe precisely, because they were ordinary days, full of ordinary tasks, and yet they felt entirely altered from the inside. He came to her property every morning. Sometimes there was work to be done together and they did it, and sometimes there was not and they simply talked, or read in companionable silence on her porch with the Texas afternoon laid out gold and enormous before them. She began to understand that what she had taken for reticence in him was not actually reticence but something more like a profound respect for the natural pace of things. He was not withholding. He was simply unhurried. He was a man who had built a ranch with his hands and understood that nothing of lasting value grew quickly, and he extended that same patience to every relationship he valued. She also began to understand the ways in which he had been watching out for her for 2 years without making it visible. The arrangement he had quietly made with Caleb Ruiz to ensure that her father's fence line was checked regularly during the worst of the winter. The fact that, when she had needed a new well dug the previous summer, the crew had arrived within a week of her mentioning it to him and had charged her only materials, which was a price she now realized had been significantly subsidized. The copy of the legal statutes regarding property rights for women in Texas that had appeared in her mailbox one day with no accompanying note, which she had assumed was a publication from the county and now suspected was nothing of the kind. She confronted him about this last one. He did not deny it. He met her eyes with a complete lack of apology. "You needed to know your rights," he said simply. "You had just come through losing your father, and you were surrounded by men who assumed that meant the property situation was automatically up for renegotiation. Like Delbert Cross. Cross was the most overt of them. He was not the only one." She felt something fierce and protective move through her on his behalf, which surprised her, because she was used to that feeling operating in one direction. "You have been looking out for me. I have been in a position to be useful," he said. It seemed wasteful not to use the position. That is the most characteristically Jasper Walker thing I have ever heard anyone say. He looked at her with that quiet half-smile that was the most expressive thing on his face. "I will take that as a compliment." "It was one," she said, and meant it more completely than she had meant almost anything in recent memory. On the 10th day, a letter arrived from Robert Ashby in Abilene. It was addressed to Margaret, and it was thorough and professional, and it confirmed everything Jasper had predicted. The Conley property documentation was clean and unassailable. The 1864 settlement record was sufficient to close the claim entirely. Ashby had filed the necessary papers with the county recorder's office and had sent formal notification to Delbert Cross that any further action would be contested vigorously. Cross was not heard from again. Margaret read the letter twice on her porch and then sat for a while looking out at her father's land, the southern 40 acres that Cross had tried to take, lying there in the afternoon sun in its unpretentious Texas way, stubborn and enduring. She found she was crying without particularly deciding to. The quiet kind of crying that is really more of a release than a grief. The kind that happens when something you have been bracing against suddenly no longer needs to be braced against. Jasper found her there when he rode up in the late afternoon. He read the look on her face, took in the letter in her hand, and sat down in the other porch chair without a word. He let her have the moment. After a little while he reached over and briefly covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that as the sun went lower and the light changed to that particular warm rose gold of Texas evenings. "I'm not going to San Francisco," she said. He said nothing. He simply held her hand and let the truth of the thing settle. "I realized something," she said. "I was going there for the wrong reason, not because I love him, not genuinely. Because I was afraid that what is here," she paused, and the pause was full of everything, "was too good to be real. And I have learned to be suspicious of things that are too good to be real." "I understand that," he said. "You should know that I am going to keep being suspicious for a while," she said. "I am not capable of simply switching off the alarm just because I have decided to trust you. There will be times when I am afraid for no good reason and I may be difficult." "Margaret," he said, with the gentlest possible note of something that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "You are already difficult. I have been aware of that for 2 years. I am not frightened of it." She looked at him sideways with wet eyes and something that was almost a laugh. "That was an extremely blunt thing to say. You said you appreciated bluntness." "I do," she admitted. "Terribly." She wrote the letter to Harlan Prout that evening. She did it herself, without asking for help or input, because it was a thing she needed to do herself. She told him plainly that she had decided not to come to San Francisco, that she appreciated his care of her father, and that she wished him well in his practice. It was a good letter. It closed the thing without cruelty and without equivocation. She sealed it and put it in the outgoing mail the next morning and felt, as she did it, an extraordinary lightness, as though she had been carrying a stone she had become so accustomed to that she had forgotten it was there. The remaining 4 days before what had been her planned departure date passed in a particular sweetness. He took her riding on the 11th day, out across the Walker Ranch and into the broader range beyond the south fence, through a stretch of open country that opened up without warning into a small valley with a creek running through it, clear and cool, lined with old cottonwood trees. He had not shown her this place before. "Thomas and I used to come here," he said, in the tone of someone sharing something they have kept private for a long time. "When we were boys, our father did not know about it for years." She stood beside him in the shade of the cottonwoods and looked at the creek and felt the gift of it, not just the beauty of the place but the choice to share it, the choice to let her into the geography of his private history. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he agreed, looking at her. She met his eyes and did not look away. He stepped closer and lifted one hand and touched her face with a gentleness that was almost unbearable, the pad of his thumb at her cheek, and she stood very still and let herself be touched, which was its own courage. "Margaret," he said, low and quiet. "I know," she said. He kissed her then, softly, and with a care that carried in it every conversation they had ever had, every careful year of patience and attention, and choosing the right moment. She stood in the shade of the cottonwoods beside the creek in the valley that had been his secret place with his lost brother, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding, all of it, with no reservation and no protective distance and no alarm, and the world around them was very still and very large and very much their own. When they broke apart, he kept his hand at her face for a moment, looking at her the way a man looks when he is trying to make certain a thing is real. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "for a very long time." "I know," she said again, and now there was a smile in it, bright and genuine, the smile that came from the deepest part of her rather than the careful managed surface, and she watched him see it and watched what seeing it did to his face, which was open in a way she had not seen before, utterly unguarded, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever witnessed. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, and he helped her down from the horse and kept hold of her hand for a moment after her feet were on the ground. And Caleb Ruiz, who was working near the barn, saw this and looked immediately away with an expression of a man who has just witnessed the resolution of something he has been waiting on for 2 years and finds the resolution satisfying. On the 12th day, he asked her to come to Sunday dinner at the ranch house properly, as his intended guest, not as a neighbor. She came in her best dress, the deep blue one she wore on formal occasions, and he had cleaned the house with more thoroughness than his usual standard, and he had cooked, which she had not known he could do. He made a beef stew that was serious and good, and biscuits from a recipe his mother had left written in the back of her Bible, which he produced with a slightly self-conscious pride that she found completely charming. After dinner they sat on the ranch house porch while the stars came out overhead, the vast Texas sky doing its enormous nightly thing, and she told him about her mother who had died when Margaret was 12, and who had been a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable stubbornness, which explained a great deal. He listened to this with his full attention and asked questions that demonstrated he had actually heard everything she said. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She was," Margaret said. She was the sort of woman who made everyone around her feel that mediocrity was a choice, and therefore inexcusable. It was both inspiring and exhausting to grow up with. "I see the influence clearly," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a criticism?" "It is a description," he said, "one I find entirely admirable." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I was afraid I had become her worst qualities without her best ones, her stubbornness without her warmth, her self-sufficiency without her capacity for joy." "You have all of it," he said simply. The stubbornness and the warmth and the self-sufficiency and the joy. You keep the joy locked up most of the time, but it is there. I have seen it. She looked at him for a long time. When? The night we found your father's document, when you pressed it against your chest and closed your eyes. That was joy. She had not known he had seen that. She had thought he had looked away. He had not looked away. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his, and they sat together on the ranch house porch under the Texas stars while the night went deep and the ranch went quiet around them. And it was the most at home she had felt in any place since before her mother died, and she recognized that and let herself feel it. On the 13th day he asked her to marry him. Not with the careful advance notice of the hotel dining room, when he had said he was asking to court her with the full intention of asking when she was ready. This was different. This was something that had arrived in the middle of an entirely ordinary moment, which was when she was standing in her kitchen helping him figure out the correct ratio for a batch of preserves she was making from the last of the summer fruit, and she said something funny about pectin, and he laughed. And then he looked at her with his laughter still in his face and said, without preamble or any formal staging of the moment, "Marry me, Margaret." She stopped stirring the pot on the stove. "Right now," she said. "Not right this second," he said. "Whenever you are ready. But I am asking you now because I have been ready for a long time and I do not see any reason to wait any longer." She set the wooden spoon down and turned to look at him fully. She thought about Harlan Prout, who had made her feel like a possibility he had not yet decided on. She thought about the man in St. Louis who had found her opinions inconvenient. She thought about every person who had asked her to be less than what she was, or who had made her feel that her value was contingent on factors outside her control. Then she looked at Jasper Walker in her kitchen with preserves cooking on the stove and afternoon light in the room, and everything simple and real and present. And she thought about 2 years of being seen clearly and cared for without conditions, and about cottonwood trees by a creek, and the way he kissed her like she was something worth being careful with. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen and she met him halfway, and he held her the way she had not let anyone hold her in a very long time, completely and without reservation. And she held him back. And outside the Texas sun was going gold, and the crickets were beginning their evening conversation, and the land stretched away in every direction, patient and enormous. The same land her father had worked and his father before him. The same land Jasper had built his life on. And it was, she thought, exactly enough. They were married on a Saturday in late October of 1880 at the Millhaven Community Church, which was a modest building with more character than grandeur, but which held the full population of the town without difficulty, because essentially the full population of the town was in attendance. Bess Holcomb had told 4 people the morning after the hotel coffee conversation, and from there it had proceeded with the natural efficiency of a small-town information network. The Reverend Thomas Alcott performed the ceremony with his characteristic mixture of genuine warmth and tendency toward long sentences, and Margaret wore a dress that was the color of cream and had been made by the town's seamstress Mrs. Flora Delgado, who had completed it in 2 weeks at a pace that suggested she had found the project highly motivating. Jasper wore his best suit, which he had cleaned properly in Abilene, and stood at the front of the church with Caleb Ruiz beside him as his witness. And when Margaret walked up the aisle on her own because there was no father to bring her, she walked without hesitation, with the self-possession of a woman who is doing exactly what she has decided to do. He watched her come toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic or theatrical, but because it was purely true, the face of a man who is receiving something he has wanted very much and is allowing himself, for once, to feel the full weight of it. She reached him and took his hands, and he held them without gripping, firmly and gently both at once. The words of the ceremony moved over them. She said yes when the moment came and meant it from the marrow out. He said yes, and she heard in it the same certainty she had come to trust as the most reliable thing about him. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Walker Ranch. Because the ranch house was the largest in the county and could accommodate the kind of gathering that followed a wedding in a town where everyone was invited and everyone came. Caleb had organized it with the help of Henry Draper and Boots and 3 women from the church who had arrived at 6 in the morning, with dishes and determination. There was food enough for twice the people and music from a fiddle player from the next county who had been specifically hired, and who played with an infectious energy that moved even the most reluctant dancers onto the open ground in front of the porch. Margaret danced with Jasper in the last light of the October afternoon, and he was, she discovered, better at it than she had expected. Not elegant exactly, but genuine, moving with the music with the same straightforward attention he gave everything else, his hand warm at her waist, his eyes on her face. "I did not know you could dance," she said. "There are several things you do not know about me yet," he said. "Tell me one." "I can whistle any song you name." She laughed, open and uncontrolled, the laugh she did not usually let out in public, and he smiled at her with a joy that was entirely unguarded. And around them the party continued, and the fiddle played, and the Texas evening came down soft and full of stars. And Margaret Walker, who had been Margaret Conley, and before that had been afraid, she had lost the knack of believing in good things, thought that this was the realest and best thing that had ever happened to her, and allowed herself to believe it completely. Their life together settled into itself with the naturalness of things that were always meant to be, a quality that Margaret found both surprising and deeply right. She moved from her father's farmhouse to the Walker Ranch house, which process took the better part of a week because she was systematic about packing, and he was systematically helpful in a way that involved doing whatever she asked without editorializing. She kept her father's land. The question of what to do with the Conley property had been discussed practically and without drama. They would run both properties as a combined operation, which made the Walker Ranch considerably larger and more productive, and which Caleb Ruiz agreed to take primary responsibility for managing at a salary that reflected the increased scope of the work. She also, and this was not something she had predicted about herself, found that she had opinions about the ranch house that were strong and that Jasper was entirely willing to hear. She reorganized the kitchen with a thoroughness that would have seemed imposing if he had not actively encouraged it. She put shelves in the sitting room for her books. She established a proper system for the ranch accounts, which had previously been kept in an arrangement she charitably described as creative, and which Jasper himself described, without apparent embarrassment, as a disaster. "You knew the accounts were a disaster," she said, the first time she went through them fully. "I knew the overall numbers were right," he said. "The organization was more of a work in progress. It was a work that was not progressing." "That is fair," he said. He handed her a fresh ledger and watched her set to work with an expression that was approximately the opposite of intimidated. She found that she loved the ranch. This was the genuine surprise. She had been a town woman, a teacher, a person whose life had been organized around people and words and enclosed spaces, and she had not known until she was actually living on the land whether it would suit her or feel confining. It suited her absolutely. There was a quality to the scale of it, the enormous open space, the particular daily rhythms of the land and the cattle and the seasons, that resonated with something in her character that she had not previously had a name for. She took to riding out with Jasper in the mornings with an enthusiasm that delighted him visibly, and that she made no effort to conceal. She learned the cattle. She learned the pasture rotations and the water management and the markers of a healthy versus an ailing animal. She was not going to be a cattle woman herself. She was clear-eyed about that, but she wanted to understand the thing that her husband had built, and understanding required knowledge, and she had never been afraid to seek knowledge. He taught her everything she asked. This was, she came to see, his most characteristic quality and perhaps the one she loved most purely. He never made her feel that a question was too basic or her interest too late. He explained things the way he did everything, directly and without condescension, and he listened when she made observations that ran counter to his assumptions. And on 2 separate occasions in the first 6 months of their marriage, her observations turned out to be correct, and he said so without hesitation. The first time this happened, she waited for the discomfort that experience had led her to expect from men when they were corrected by their wives. It did not come. "You are right," he said, simply and immediately. "I will try your approach." She thought of the man in St. Louis who had found her opinions more passionate than appropriate in a woman. She thought about it, and then she deliberately set it down, because it was history and Jasper Walker was the present, and the future and the present and future were very good. They had a disagreement in March, which was their first real one. It was about water rights and a claim made by a neighboring property owner to the west, a man named Gareth Sims, who was asserting access to a section of the creek that ran through the edge of the Walker land. Jasper's instinct was to accommodate partially and avoid a conflict. Margaret's instinct was that partial accommodation would invite further encroachment, and that they needed to establish the boundary clearly at the outset. The disagreement had the quality of two strong people who genuinely disagreed, which meant it was uncomfortable, and neither of them enjoyed it. They went to bed that night without resolving it, and she lay awake for a while with the discomfort of it. He got up before dawn and made coffee, and she came out to the kitchen to find him at the table with the legal maps spread before him, working through the property documentation. He had been doing this for several hours, she could tell. He looked up when she came in. "You were right," he said. "Partial accommodation is the wrong move. Sims has been doing this systematically with every property owner on that creek, and 2 of them have lost access rights because of exactly the dynamic you described. I should have seen it." She sat down across from him. She was glad she was right, and she was also struck by what it meant that he had spent the pre-dawn hours honestly reconsidering, rather than digging in. "You are a remarkable man," she said. He looked at her with slight surprise. "I was wrong, and then I was less wrong." "That is not remarkable, it is just the minimum standard." "You would be surprised," she said quietly, "how far above the minimum standard that actually is." He looked at her for a moment, and something moved in his face that was an understanding of what she was not quite saying, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a while in the pre-dawn quiet, with the coffee between them and the maps spread out, and the ranch dark and asleep around them. They handled the Sims situation correctly, engaged Ashby again to file the proper documentation, and the western boundary of the creek access was established clearly and without further contest. Gareth Sims had apparently learned from the cost of the attempt. Spring became summer, and summer found its rhythm, and Margaret was happy in a way that was not the flimsy, anxious happiness of things that might be taken away, but the deep, structural happiness of a life that had been built right. In July, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not because she was uncertain of her feelings, but because she was assembling the feelings into something coherent before she shared them. They were enormous feelings, complex and layered, and she wanted to be able to present them in some form that made sense. He came home on the 3rd day to find her in the kitchen with a particular look on her face, a look he had learned to read as the external sign of significant internal activity. "Something has happened," he said, which was not a question. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She told him. The reaction was immediate and entirely genuine, the kind of reaction that could not be planned because it was happening in the body before the mind had a chance to shape it. Something moved through his face that was enormous and bright and slightly frightened all at once, the full human complexity of a man receiving news that will change everything, and he reached for her hands and held them both in his and looked at her with an expression of such undefended joy and terrified love that her eyes filled. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I am well, and I feel well, and the baby is due in January, which I calculated from." He was out of his chair and she was in his arms before she finished the sentence, and she held on to him with both hands and let the tears come, not sad ones, not frightened ones, but the ones that come from having been given so much more than you once thought was possible that the surplus has to go somewhere. He held her for a long time in the kitchen in the July heat. "January," he said, against her hair. "January," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her face. His eyes were bright. "Boy or girl," he said, as though he could will one or the other. "We cannot know," she said. "We will have to wait and see." "I would like a boy," he said. "You would like whatever comes," she said. "Yes," he said immediately. "You are completely right." He was grinning in a way she had never seen him grin before, wide and unguarded and young-looking in a way that took 10 years off him, and showed her what he had looked like before all the loss and work and steady, serious years. A boy would be nice, though. She laughed and he kissed her, and outside the summer afternoon went on being enormous and golden. The pregnancy was, on the whole, uncomplicated. She was not a woman given to drama about physical matters, and she went about the business of being pregnant with the same practical approach she gave everything else. She reduced her writing to the gentler roots. She adjusted her work in the house and the accounts to what was comfortable, and she accepted Jasper's worry without finding it oppressive, because his worry expressed itself in useful action rather than hovering anxiety. He rode to Abilene in August and brought back a midwife named Clara Bright, who had delivered several hundred babies in her career, and who came with a reputation for thoroughness and calm that Margaret found reassuring. Clara made the trip from Abilene to the Walker Ranch twice during the autumn months to examine Margaret and report her findings, which were consistently good. They had Clara's full assessment by October, and it was positive in every respect. The baby was positioned well, the pregnancy was progressing normally, and Clara's professional opinion was that the January birth was going to be straightforward. "She is healthy and the baby is healthy," Clara told Jasper, who had been waiting in the sitting room with the barely concealed tension of a man trying very hard to appear calm. "Stop looking as though something catastrophic is imminent." "I am not," he began. "You absolutely are," Clara said pleasantly. "It is very endearing and entirely unnecessary." Margaret, overhearing this from the next room, did not attempt to suppress her smile. November brought the first real cold and the first snow, which was light by northern standards but sufficient to alter the quality of the days, making them quieter and more interior. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms. The cattle were moved to the sheltered pastures. The hands spent more time in the barn and less time on the range. The evenings were longer, and the ranch house was warm from the iron stove and the oil lamps, and Margaret spent a considerable portion of those evenings at her desk with her books and her accounts while Jasper sat across from her with whatever needed reading, and the fire went its steady way in the grate. She looked up one evening in November and found him watching her with an expression that was so uncomplicated in its tenderness that she felt it as a physical thing. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at you. You have a very specific look." "I have a very specific feeling," he said. "I was just letting it be there without doing anything with it." She held his gaze across the room, across the lamplight, across the quiet, domestic beauty of an evening that was entirely ordinary and entirely perfect. "What feeling?" she asked, though she knew. "That everything I wanted is in this room," he said. "That is a very large feeling to just sit with." She set her pen down. "Come sit with it over here," she said. He came and sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and they sat together in the warm room in the quiet house while outside the Texas winter went about its mild business, and the feeling was there between them, enormous and grateful, and completely without the anxious edge that feelings of that magnitude usually carry when you are afraid the thing can be taken away. It did not feel fragile. It felt like the ranch felt, like something built to last. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1881, at 4 in the morning, with Clara Bright in attendance and Jasper in the next room in an agony of controlled anxiety that he managed by going very still and silent in a way that Caleb Ruiz, who had come to the house and was waiting on the porch in the cold, because it had seemed wrong to be anywhere else, recognized as the absolute outer limit of his capacity for patience. The cry came before dawn, strong and indignant and entirely clear, the cry of a child arriving in the world with something to say. Clara opened the bedroom door and said, "A boy, Mr. Walker, healthy and considerable and quite loud about it." Jasper walked into the room, and there was Margaret in the bed with their son in her arms, exhausted down to the bone, and vivid with the particular aliveness of a person who has just done an extraordinary thing, and the baby was red-faced and furious, and already fisting his tiny hands. Jasper stood beside the bed and looked at them both, and he did not say anything at all for a long moment, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to what he was feeling. Margaret looked up at him from the bed and her eyes were full. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the boy in his arms, and Jasper held his son for the first time with the careful, absolute attention of a man who understands the weight of what he is holding. "Edmund," he said. She had suggested, weeks ago, that if it was a boy, they might name him for Jasper's father. She had not pushed for it, had simply offered it and left it alone. "Edmund George Walker," she said, giving her own father the middle name, and he looked at her with eyes that were not entirely dry and said nothing because what he was feeling was bigger than anything his words had a shape for. Young Edmund George Walker took to the world with an enthusiasm that was immediately evident, and that did not diminish. He was a solid, healthy, curious baby who escalated rapidly into a solid, healthy, curious child, with his father's serious dark eyes and his mother's relentless interest in understanding how things worked, and the combined effect was a small person who needed, Jasper said once to Margaret in the conspiratorial tone of two parents watching their toddler systematically disassemble a harmless object, to know the reason for every single thing. "He gets that from you," Margaret said. "He gets that from you," Jasper said. They looked at each other, and both conceded simultaneously that it was probably both of them. Edmund learned to walk on the ranch house porch in March of 1882, lurching between his parents with an expression of intense concentration and a willingness to fall and try again that Jasper watched with a pride so large it embarrassed him slightly. He brought Edmund out to the barn for the first time in April, holding him against his shoulder while the boy stared at the horses with enormous eyes and did not cry, which Caleb noted approvingly. "He is going to be a good ranch hand," Caleb said. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Margaret said, from where she was standing at the barn door, but she was smiling as she said it, and Caleb grinned and did not push the point. They added a room to the ranch house in the autumn of 1882, because the house that had been sufficient for one man was becoming somewhat full with 3 people, and all of the books and maps and ledgers that accumulated when you ran a combined operation, and had a wife with a reading habit and an organizing impulse of professional quality. The addition gave them a proper library and study, which Margaret arranged with the thoroughness she applied to all such projects, and which Jasper admitted privately was the best room in the house. The years continued. They were good years, not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty was real, but good in the way of things built right, with setbacks that were survived and learned from, and problems that were solved because 2 people who were genuinely good at different things were working on them together. There was a difficult winter in 1883 when cattle losses were higher than expected, and the cash position of the ranch was tighter than comfortable. Margaret's accounting precision turned out to be the thing that allowed them to navigate it clearly, because she knew exactly where they stood at every point and could make decisions accordingly, and Jasper's knowledge of which costs could be deferred, and which could not meant they came through it without taking on debt that would have compounded the problem. There was a range dispute in the summer of 1884 that involved a newcomer to the county who made the mistake of assuming that a woman looking at his paperwork would not understand what she was looking at. Margaret understood precisely what she was looking at. She explained, with a courtesy that had steel underneath it, the exact section of Texas property law that applied to the situation and the precise manner in which the newcomer's claim was deficient. The dispute was resolved in their favor with a minimum of drama and a maximum of clarity. Jasper had watched this exchange from the edge of the situation where he had positioned himself in case he was needed, and had concluded, with great satisfaction, that he was not. She had looked at him afterward with a slightly challenging expression, as though she expected him to say something qualifying. "That was beautifully done," he said. "Most men find it irritating," she said. "I am not most men," he said, with such simple certainty that she shook her head slightly and went back into the house with a smile that she was not entirely trying to hide. A daughter came in the spring of 1885. She arrived in the world in a much more serene fashion than her brother had, taking her time about it in a way that Clara Bright, now making a third trip to the Walker Ranch to exercise her professional skills, characterized as showing excellent judgment. Her name was Rose Eliza Walker, for no particular historical figure, but because Margaret had always loved the name Rose and Eliza had been her mother's name, and the combination had a sound to it that satisfied some requirement that Margaret could not precisely articulate but felt with certainty. Rose Eliza was a placid and observant child who watched the world with an equanimity that her parents found both impressive and slightly humorous in someone so new to it. Edmund, who was 4.5 and had very strong opinions about most things, observed his sister with an initial suspicion that modulated over the course of several weeks into a tentative interest, and eventually into a proprietary affection that expressed itself in bringing her objects he considered significant and presenting them with an explanatory monologue. "He is explaining the ranch to her," Jasper said, watching this from the porch. "She appears to be considering the information," Margaret said. Rose was, at that moment, looking at the piece of leather harness Edmund had brought her with an expression of focused evaluation. "She is going to be a serious person," Jasper said. "Good," Margaret said. "There is plenty to be serious about." He looked at her sideways. The porch was warm in the April afternoon. Rose had apparently reached a conclusion about the harness and was attempting to put it in her mouth. Edmund was redirecting her with the careful patience of someone who has been told several times to watch out for exactly this. "Are you happy?" Jasper asked. It was a question he asked occasionally, not out of insecurity, but out of genuine and continuing interest in the honest answer. He had always believed that happiness was a thing to be checked on regularly, like the state of a fence or the level of a well, to make sure it was still there and still sound. Margaret looked at her 2 children on the porch and at the ranch spread out beyond them and at the man beside her who had said, once, in the absolute best sentence she had ever heard addressed to her, that he was coming with her and who had instead stayed and who had built with her something that made the whole concept of going away to San Francisco feel like a story about someone else's life. "Yes," she said, genuinely and entirely. He reached over and took her hand. She held it. The afternoon went on around them in its golden, unhurried way. Edmund was now attempting to show Rose the proper use of a wood chip, a lesson she seemed receptive to. Somewhere across the south pasture, Caleb was running the cattle through the spring check with Henry and Boots, the familiar sounds of the working ranch carrying on the warm air. Everything was in order. Everything was, in the way of things built with care and time, and 2 people who were honest with each other, better than order. It was alive and growing and deeply, permanently their own. 3 more years passed in the way of good years, with enough in them to keep life full and enough steadiness to allow things to take root. Edmund began his schooling, which in the absence of a school in Millhaven meant his mother taught him, which she did with a thoroughness that reflected both her training and her belief that education was not a thing to be done half-heartedly. He was a quick student with strong opinions about which subjects interested him, and which did not, which Margaret did not permit to limit his exposure to the ones he found less compelling. "You do not have to love arithmetic," she told him when he was 6. "You have to understand it, those are different requirements." Edmund considered this with the face of someone weighing a legal argument. "But you love arithmetic," he said. "I do," she agreed. "But I also know people who do not love it and manage perfectly well, because they understand it. You must understand it. Whether you love it is your own business." Edmund appeared to find this contractually acceptable and returned to his sums with more cooperative energy. Jasper watched these exchanges with a pleasure that was quiet but very deep. He had not anticipated this specific joy, which was the joy of watching the woman you love be herself in a context that let all of her qualities operate at full capacity. She was magnificent with Edmund and with Rose, who was now into everything and had developed a particular interest in the horses that exceeded even her brother's early enthusiasm. She was not performing motherhood. She was doing it the way she did everything else, with her whole self and without pretense. He came home from a cattle drive in October of 1887 to find her in the study with a letter spread on the desk before her, reading it with an expression he could not immediately identify. "What is that?" he asked. She looked up. The expression resolved into something between amusement and real feeling. "It is from Harlan Prout," she said. He paused. "He is getting married," she said. "He wrote to tell me. I think because he was perhaps operating with some remaining uncertainty about how things stood between us, and he wanted to close it cleanly, which I respect." She paused. "She is a nurse. She sounds, from his description, like a woman of genuine capability and patience." "Patience being a necessity with Prout," Jasper said, with more mildness than he felt. She looked at him with precise knowledge of what he was actually feeling and a smile that acknowledged it. "His timing has always been somewhat off," she agreed. "But I think in this case he has arrived somewhere real, eventually." "Good for him," Jasper said, meaning it more than he expected to. She folded the letter and put it aside and stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around him in the straightforward, unself-conscious way she had developed of expressing physical affection, a way that had taken her some time to arrive at and that he treasured precisely because of the distance she had traveled to get there. He held her. "I am very glad," she said against his shoulder, "that you came in through that kitchen door." "I am very glad," he said, "that I found you at the table. And that you said what you said. And that you did not send the letter." She held him a little tighter. "I almost did," she said. "The morning of that day, I nearly took it to the stage myself." "I know," he said. "I am glad you didn't." "So am I," she said. "So am I." The Walker Ranch in Greer County, Texas grew into one of the most respected operations in the region over the following years, which was a result of two people who were each very good at different things and who trusted each other's judgment entirely, and who were, in addition, not afraid of hard work or of changing their approach when the evidence suggested they should. Caleb Ruiz eventually bought a property of his own from his accumulated wages and management bonus, and he and his wife, a capable woman named Teresa who had grown up on a cattle ranch in New Mexico, and who got along immediately and permanently with Margaret in a way that suggested they recognized something essential in each other, became their nearest and most valued neighbors. Henry Draper retired in 1889 to a small house in town that he had been saving for since 1881, and Boots, who was by then of an age that no one was quite sure about but that was certainly significant, was given a comfortable permanent situation at the ranch that asked nothing more of him than feeding the chickens and telling stories to Edmund and Rose, a role he filled with considerable dignity. Edmund was 11 when the new decade turned. He was tall like his father and precise like his mother, and had his own particular quality that was neither of them exactly, which was a kind of easy sociability that made him effortlessly well-liked without him seeming to try. He had decided at 10 that he was going to run the ranch, and had announced this to his parents with a directness that they both recognized as coming equally from both sides of his inheritance. "There are many things you might decide to do," Margaret told him. "I have decided this one," Edmund said, with complete serenity. Jasper caught her eye over Edmund's head. She pressed her lips together against a smile. Rose was 8 and had grown into the serious, observant child they had predicted, with a quality of stillness that was not shyness but watchfulness, and an affinity for the horses that had become the defining fact of her childhood. She could ride by the time she was 4, properly ride, not just be sat in the saddle, and by 8 she was handling animals that some of the hands were respectful of, with a natural authority that had something of her mother in it and something that was entirely her own. In the spring of 1891, Margaret told Jasper she was pregnant again. She told him in the same table, though the table was newer now, the old one finally replaced 2 years ago. She told him simply and directly, and he received it the way he had received Edmund's coming and Rose's coming, with a joy that was enormous and immediately practical, asking how she was feeling and what she needed, and whether Clara Bright was still available in Abilene. Clara Bright was still available in Abilene, and she came to the Walker Ranch in January of 1892 for the 3rd time in her professional life, and delivered their 2nd son in the early morning, who was named Thomas James Walker, for Jasper's brother and for Margaret's father's middle name, and who came into the world with a set of lungs that suggested he had strong feelings about his arrival and intended to make them known. Edmund, 12, received this new brother with the solemn dignity of someone who has been the elder son long enough to understand what it means. Rose, 9, immediately claimed the right to name him, was gently corrected on the logistics of naming, and then accepted Thomas James with the equanimity that characterized everything she did, and set about explaining the ranch to him in very clear terms, beginning, for reasons nobody fully understood, with the classification of horses by temperament. Jasper stood in the kitchen one evening in the spring of 1892 with Thomas in his arms, the baby being currently in the phase of looking at everything, with the focused intensity of someone conducting a thorough inventory. And Margaret was reading at the table with a cup of tea, and Rose was at the window watching the late evening yard, and Edmund was in the study working on his mathematics with the borrowed concentration of a boy who has decided his mother is right and arithmetic is necessary even if not lovable. He stood there and held his son and looked at his home and his family arranged in their ordinary evening positions, and felt the same thing he had felt for years, the thing that had arrived quietly and built itself into something he had not known how to name when it was just beginning, and that he knew now with his whole self, the bone-deep knowledge of a life that was exactly what a life was supposed to be. Margaret looked up from her book as though she had felt him looking. He smiled at her. She smiled back, and in her smile was everything, the woman she had been when she came to his kitchen door with suspicion and hurt and magnificent stubbornness, and the woman she was now, who had let herself be loved and had loved in return with the same full commitment she gave everything else, and all the years between those two women that they had spent building something real. The ranch went on. The land went on. The Texas sky went on being enormous and indifferent and unutterably beautiful. And in the kitchen, where a sealed letter had once sat on a table like a verdict, and where a man had walked in from the trail dust and said, without thinking, without planning, with the purest and most certain instinct of his entire life, that he was coming with her wherever she went, there was a family that had been built from exactly that moment, from that choice, from two people who had been honest enough and brave enough and, in the end, lucky enough to find each other before the window closed. It had not been luck entirely. Margaret thought that sometimes. It had been him walking through that door at exactly the right moment. It had been her not sending the letter quite yet. It had been the particular geography of two neighboring properties and two solitary people, and 2 years of patient, accumulating conversation that had built something without either of them quite intending to build it, until the thing was so built that the idea of its not existing had become impossible to hold in the mind. She set her book down and looked at her husband with their son in his arms in the lamplit kitchen of the ranch house they had made together, and she thought, as she had thought many times and would think many times more, that the best thing she had ever done was stay. Not because leaving would have been wrong exactly, because staying had turned out to be everything. She had been looking for a shape to a future. She had found one. It was this shape, this house and these children and this man, this ranch in Greer County, Texas, under the enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky, this life that was more than she had known to want and exactly what she needed. She got up from the table and crossed to him and stood beside him and looked at Thomas, who was now, apparently, satisfied with his inventory of the room, and had arranged himself comfortably in his father's arms with the boneless confidence of a baby who trusts his world completely. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly. The baby considered her with dark, serious eyes. "He looks like you," Jasper said. "He looks like himself," she said. "Give him time." He shifted the baby and put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the kitchen was warm and the house was full of their children, and outside the Texas night was doing its vast, quiet, permanent thing. This was the shape of it. This was the thing with a future attached. Not San Francisco, not a letter on a table, not a man of managed distances and oblique invitations. This, all of this. Jasper kissed the top of her head and she felt him smile against her hair. "Glad you stayed," he said. "Every single day," she said. And she meant it as she meant everything, completely and without reservation, down to the very bottom of herself.